What happens when a god is summoned to prove himself and fails? On that day at Mount Carmel, Baal was exposed and embarrassed. Israel was starving, the skies locked shut, and Baal, the storm god, abandoned his prophets. Into that famine walked one man, Elijah, carrying a word that could split a nation. This was not myth. This was trial. The people, the jury, heaven, the judge, and the verdict was unforgettable. A false god challenged, a nation forced to choose. This day was never buried. It's in plain sight for anyone willing to see, and once you see how Yahweh unmasked Baal, you'll never look at false gods the same way again. Leave a comment if you know this story, and hit subscribe for more. Now, to the Canaanites, Baal meant Lord. He was the storm bringer, the rider of the clouds, the god of thunder, rain, and fertile fields. He was the deity every farmer longed for, the one who promised to break drought and make crops rise tall. Baal was usually pictured hurling lightning and bringing storms upon the land in Ugaritic tradition. But in Israel, Baal was not native. He was imported. When King Ahab married Jezebel, daughter of the king of Sidon, she brought with her the full machinery of Baal worship. Altars rose in Samaria, carved poles honoured Asherah, and Jezebel fed hundreds of Baal's prophets at her royal table. This was not only a matter of worship, it was politics. By marrying Jezebel, Ahab bound Israel into Sidonian alliances. Baal's cult was the religious arm of Phoenician power, tied to trade, agriculture, and the sea routes that made Tyre and Sidon rich. To enthrone Baal in Israel was to fuse covenant identity with a foreign empire. What looked like piety was really policy, and it demanded not just loyalty, but submission. This was no little side cult. It was a state religion, enforced with blood. The prophets of Yahweh were hunted, driven into hiding, some slaughtered outright. Obadiah, a servant of the king, had to hide 100 of them in caves just to keep them alive. This is the backstory often forgotten when we picture Elijah stepping onto Mount Carmel. Israel was not merely undecided, it was under siege. Baal had captured the king, the queen, and the public square. The covenant voice of Yahweh was reduced to whispers in caves, and then the sky closed. The famine was not chance weather, it was covenant judgment. Centuries earlier, Moses had warned the nation, "Take care lest you turn aside to other gods. Then the anger of the Lord will be kindled, and he will shut up the heavens so that there will be no rain." Deuteronomy 11. Now the curse had arrived in full force. The heavens hardened like bronze, the earth like iron. Livestock dropped in the fields, rivers shrank into dust, parents watched children waste away. Every prayer to Baal rose into empty skies. It is here that Elijah first enters the story. His very name carried the indictment, Eliyahu. My God is Yahweh. He did not appear as a court official or royal advisor. He arrived like a thunderclap, announced the judgment of drought, and then vanished into hiding. While the land gasped for breath, the prophet lived under Yahweh's strange provision. Ravens carried him bread and meat beside the brook Cherith. When that brook dried, he was sent north into Sidonian territory, into Zarephath, the very homeland of Jezebel's Baal. There, a starving widow found her flour and oil never empty, and when her son collapsed lifeless, Elijah prayed him back to life. Baal promised fertility, rain, and renewal, but only Yahweh provided them, and in secret. Meanwhile, Ahab searched the land for pasture. Scripture shows us the king wandering fields, desperate to save his horses, while Jezebel kept her prophets feasting at the palace. The contrast could not be sharper, Yahweh sustaining life through scarcity, Baal presiding over famine and silence. 3.5 years passed. Not a drop fell. The silence grew louder than thunder. The storm god was on trial in his own domain, and he had failed. The people who had bent the knee to Baal found themselves bent double by hunger. And still, the queen's cult endured, propped up by fear and blood. When Elijah stepped back into the sun, the stage was set. Israel was ready for a trial. Baal was about to be challenged. The famine had entered its third year when Elijah emerged from obscurity to confront Israel's king. Ahab scoured the valleys. No prayer to Baal cracked the sky. When Elijah stood before him, the king did not see deliverance but blame. He branded Elijah a troubler, the cause of the curse. Yet the silence of heaven was already a verdict against Baal, the storm god who could not send rain. From that meeting, the summons was issued. Israel was called to Mount Carmel, a ridge that overlooked the Mediterranean, long regarded as sacred ground by both Yahweh's prophets and Baal's priests. Its very location made it a stage for confrontation, a borderland between covenant and compromise. On its slopes, altars had risen to competing powers, but now the mountain itself would serve as witness, its stones a silent jury. The nation gathered. Hungry men, hollow-eyed women, and weary elders pressed together on the hillside. Their voices were hushed, their hearts suspended between loyalty and fear. Before them stood the prophets of Baal, 450 strong, arrayed in their ceremonial garments, eager to prove their God still lived. Opposite them stood Elijah alone, a solitary figure who bore no priestly pageantry, only the authority of covenant. The people lingered in hesitation, unwilling to choose, waiting for a sign that would force decision. Their silence was itself an indictment, a generation paralyzed by divided hearts. Ancient Israel knew verdicts by ordeal, God decides. Mount Carmel became that stage. Elijah refused debate. He asked heaven to answer. The test was simple. 2 altars, no fire. The God who answers by fire is God. This wasn't spectacle. It was a sacred lawsuit. Jezebel's shrines multiplied, Baal's prophets seduced, Ahab consented, and Deuteronomy's curses stood open before their eyes. By calling the nation to Carmel, Elijah was summoning them to witness the case brought against Baal and against themselves. The air on the mountain was heavy with tension. Dust rose as crowds shifted uneasily. The altar stones waited, mute and cold. Even before fire, it felt like judgment assembled. The confrontation was not merely between Elijah and Baal's prophets, but between covenant fidelity and idolatrous betrayal. The mountain itself seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the divine reply. This was not merely a contest of power. It was covenant renewal disguised as trial. The people had been drawn into a sacred lawsuit, summoned to choose life or death, blessing or curse. And Elijah, standing alone against hundreds, staked the verdict on a single claim. The God who answers by fire, he is God. The crowd's silence lingered, the tension sharpened, and the test was set. The first to speak would be Baal's prophets. The trial began with noise. Listen. From morning light until noon, the prophets of Baal surged around their altar, their chants echoing across the mountain. Their rituals were not improvised chaos but drawn from Canaanite cult practice, where priests believed ecstatic frenzy could compel divine presence. They leapt, they shouted, they danced in circles until their bodies shook with exhaustion. The crowd watched, eyes darting between the spectacle and the unbroken sky above them. As hours dragged on, desperation thickened. Baal, storm god of thunder, rain, and harvest, was mute. Here, in the very domain of his supposed power, there was nothing. No cloud, no spark, no voice. The silence grew heavier with every cry that faded into the dry air. When no answer came, the priests resorted to blood. Drawing blades across their own skin, they slashed arms and torsos until the ground darkened beneath them. This was no mere theatre. Canaanite belief held that the blood of the worshipper could stir the god to act, as though sacrifice of the body itself might provoke rain from the heavens. In that moment, Israel saw the heart of idolatry exposed, gods that demand life but give none in return. The priests bled, but the sky remained closed. Archaeological finds at Ugarit describe priests of Baal and Anat slashing their skin in ritual mourning, believing blood and pain could stir the god from death or sleep. This was not desperation invented in the moment. It was tradition, carried into Israel through Phoenician influence. Their bodies became living offerings, poured out to awaken a storm that never came. 1 Kings 18:29 spares no detail. There was no voice, no one answered, no one paid attention. The triple denial underscores futility. The storm god was powerless, silent before his own worshippers. The people saw the covenant curses embodied, not only famine in the land, but emptiness in the gods they had chosen. By contrast, Elijah was calm. As the prophets collapsed in exhaustion, he stepped forward with deliberate calm. His first act was repair. Before the nation, he rebuilt the Lord's ruined altar with 12 stones, one for each tribe. A physical sermon. The covenant was fractured, but it could be restored. Each stone was a reminder of Jacob's sons, of Sinai, of a God who had bound himself to his people. Then he raised the sacrifice. He ordered water to be poured over the wood, once, twice, 3 times, until the trench around the altar overflowed. The act defied human logic. In a land where water was scarce, he drenched the very elements meant to burn. Yet the meaning was unmistakable. This was no human trick, no hidden spark. The people knew the history of what happened at Sinai. Elijah's drenched altar recalled that moment, daring them to believe the same God could descend again, not in myth, but in flame before their eyes. Only a living God could answer such an impossible test. The scene was as much memory as miracle. 12 stones recalled covenant. Water evoked the Red Sea and the Jordan, barriers God had parted. Every act Elijah performed turned the people's eyes back to history, to a pattern of deliverance they had forgotten. His calm authority stood as living contrast to Baal's priests, who had cut themselves into silence. The crowd felt the weight of what was unfolding. They had seen Baal's prophets give all their strength, all their blood, and receive nothing. Now they watched Elijah, alone, set impossible odds against himself, confident that Yahweh would answer. The mountain was hushed again, but this time the silence was different. It was the stillness before judgment, the pause before fire. There was no voice. Baal had failed. The trial had moved to its decisive moment, and all eyes turned to the lone prophet, waiting for him to call upon the God of Israel. The mountain falls silent as Elijah steps forward. The frenzy of Baal's prophets has collapsed into exhaustion, their blood drying in the dust, their cries unanswered. Now the trial shifts. A single man stands against hundreds, but he carries Israel's covenant on his shoulders. He lifts his voice, not in frenzy, not in prolonged chants, but in words rooted in history and promise. He invokes the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, recalling the fathers who once built altars in this land. His prayer is brief: no magic incantations, no mutilation, no manipulation, just the steady appeal that God would make himself known, turning the hearts of his people back. In that moment, the contrast is absolute. Baal's priests had tried to summon a storm god, master of fire and rain, yet their altar lies untouched. Elijah prays once, and the response comes not from manipulation, but from heaven itself. Fire falls. Not a flicker, not a stray bolt of lightning, but a torrent of consuming flame that swallows sacrifice, wood, stone, soil, and even the water filling the trench. The text insists on the totality. Nothing remained. This is no natural lightning strike, for lightning scorches, but does not vaporize stone and soil. This is theophany, God's presence breaking into creation with consuming force. Israel had seen fire before, at Sinai, in the wilderness, where fire fell on the altar to mark divine acceptance. In David's day, fire consumed sacrifice on Araunah's threshing floor, marking the site of the temple. Elijah's prayer pulls all of that memory into a single moment. The God who answered by fire before answers again, this time on a mountain contested by Baal. Sinai's fire now ignites Carmel, declaring that the covenant God is still alive, still present, still sovereign. The people cannot stand. They fall prostrate, the entire assembly collapsing as the verdict resounds in flame. Their confession rises like thunder. The Lord, He is God. This is no new name, but the oldest one, Yahweh, the covenant God of their fathers. What Baal could not prove with storm or rain, Yahweh demonstrates in fire that cannot be ignored. Picture the scene: the roar of flame, the rush of heat, the silence broken by cries of awe and terror, dust rising as thousands hit the ground at once. A moment carved into memory, the exposure of a false god, the vindication of the true. This is not simply miracle, it is judgment, revelation, and renewal all in one. Would you have trembled there? Would your knees have buckled as the stones turned to ash? The people saw what they could not deny, God Himself stepping into the trial, rendering a verdict without words. This was the day Baal was unmasked, a god of storm who could not summon rain, nor ignite wood, a god who demanded blood but gave nothing in return, exposed before the nation, his prophets mute, his altar untouched, his claims undone. The fire does not only consume, it reveals. It shows the emptiness of idols and the holiness of the living God. The verdict has been rendered, but the trial is not over. For once the false has been exposed, judgment must fall, and the heavens, long shut, must open again. The fire has spoken. Now the rain must return. Elijah gave the order that could not be avoided. The prophets of Baal were seized and taken down to the Kishon brook. That valley had heard Israel's battles before. Deborah and Barak once sang of Sisera's army swept away at the Kishon's torrent. Now it would echo with judgment again. The false prophets, voices of deception, were cut down. Their blood flowed where rain would soon return, a grim cleansing before renewal. This was not vengeance for personal injury. It was covenant justice. Deuteronomy had warned that prophets enticing Israel to other gods must be put to death, for their words threatened the very life of the people. Elijah enforced what Israel had forgotten. Loyalty to Yahweh was not optional, it was survival. Idolatry drained the land as surely as drought. To leave Baal's prophets alive was to invite the famine again. Only when the judgment was finished did Elijah turn his face to the sky. The heavens still burned with drought, clouds absent, earth cracked. But now the verdict was delivered, and blessing could follow. Elijah climbed to the summit of Carmel, bowed low, and prayed. His servant searched the horizon again and again. 6 times he saw nothing. The 7th time he reported a cloud, small as a man's hand, rising from the sea. That image was enough. Elijah knew what it meant. Mercy was on the move. The sky began to darken. Wind shifted, cool and sharp. Clouds multiplied over the horizon until the whole canopy turned black. Rain came, heavy, unrelenting, pouring over a land that had forgotten what blessing felt like. The cracked soil drank deeply, rivers surged, cattle raised their heads as grass would soon return. The covenant curse had lifted, replaced with covenant mercy. And in the downpour, Elijah ran. Ahab's chariot strained against the storm, wheels slipping in the mud. But the prophet, strengthened by the Spirit, outran the king all the way to Jezreel. It was more than speed. It was sign. The prophet went before the throne of Israel, God's word ahead of the king's power. From fire to rain, from judgment to renewal, from silence to abundance. Israel had seen the storm god fail. Now they saw the true Lord summon clouds with a word. The irony was unmissable. Baal, worshipped as the bringer of rain, had been mute through years of drought. Yahweh, who withheld rain to expose falsehood, now unleashed it to restore life. This is the rhythm of covenant. Holiness cuts down what deceives. Mercy waters what remains. The Kishon's blood and Carmel's rain belong to the same verdict. Yahweh alone rules life and death, famine and abundance. Would you have trusted him in the drought long enough to see the cloud rise? Or would fear have tied your heart to a mute idol, hoping for rain that never comes, and the sky grew black with clouds? That line does more than describe weather. It names the moment creation itself bore witness that Baal was no god, and Israel's future rested once again under the hand of the Lord. The famine ended, but its memory lingered. Israel had seen what no generation could forget: the silence of Baal and the fire of Yahweh. What began as cracked earth and withered vines ended as storm clouds rolling in, proof that the covenant curse and the covenant blessing were in the hand of one God alone. Elijah stood at the center of it all, not as a magician, not as a performer, but as the prophet whose very name testified, "My God is Yahweh." He had stood against a king, against a queen, against 450 prophets, and against the collective indecision of a nation. And the verdict was rendered not by sword or speech, but by flame from heaven and rain from above. This was no myth. It was no local skirmish of cults. Mount Carmel became a courtroom. The people were the jury, the mountain the witness stand, and heaven the judge. Baal was summoned, pressed for testimony, called to answer by fire, and found guilty. Yahweh alone delivered the evidence. The pattern was sealed into memory. Silence where idols promise, fire where God speaks, rain where his mercy restores. The Lord, he is God. That cry, shouted by a whole people with faces pressed to the soil, was the only possible verdict. The prophets of Baal were cut down at Kishon. The storm broke across the horizon. The famine lifted. Judgment and mercy held hands on the mountain, and Israel, if only for a moment, remembered her covenant God. The trial of Baal was not a spectacle of ancient religion. It was revelation, a false god exposed, a covenant renewed, a people called back to life. If this journey stirred something in you, do not let it vanish in the noise. There are more whispers hidden in Scripture's pages, waiting to be uncovered. Stay with us. Subscribe, listen closer, and keep walking this narrow road between thunder and silence. I look forward to seeing you again.